The dust of the Rockies swirled around Sophia Lancaster as she sat alone on the weathered steps of St. Elmo's only church, her tears leaving clean tracks down her dirt-smudged cheeks. It was Sunday, May 14, 1882, and while the sound of hymns floated through the white-painted doors behind her, she couldn't bring herself to join the congregation inside. Not today of all days. Frank Taylor spotted her as he rode into town, the brim of his hat pulled low against the morning sun. He wasn't one for church services, but something about the solitary figure on the steps made him rein in his horse. A woman crying alone on a Sunday morning was the sort of thing that nagged at a man, even one who preferred the company of cattle to people most days. He dismounted with the ease of someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than on solid ground, hitched his horse to a nearby post, and approached cautiously. His spurs jangled softly with each step, announcing his presence before he spoke. "Madam," he said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest, "why aren't you inside?" She looked up, startled by the interruption, and when their eyes met, her composure crumbled completely. Her shoulders shook as she began to cry in earnest, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth to stifle the sound. Frank shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't intended to make things worse, and now he found himself standing awkwardly before a weeping woman with no idea what to do next. At 30 years old, he'd faced down rustlers, survived blizzards, and once stared down a grizzly, but a crying woman left him utterly at a loss. "I apologize if I've upset you, madam," he said, taking a step back. "I'll leave you be." "No," she managed through her tears, reaching out as if to stop him. "Please don't go, it's not you, it's just—" She took a shuddering breath. "Today would have been my wedding day." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. "Would have been?" he asked gently. "My fiancé, Daniel." She swallowed hard. "He died in the mine collapse 3 months ago." Frank's expression softened. The disaster at the Mary Murphy mine had been the worst the area had seen in years. 12 men lost, families shattered, and the whole town of St. Elmo still mourning. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam," he said, meaning it. "Daniel Brady," she nodded, surprised. "You knew him." "Not well," Frank admitted. "But he had a good reputation, strong worker, honest man." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. Yes, he was." Frank hesitated, then carefully sat down on the step beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I'm Frank Taylor. I run cattle about 20 miles west of here." "Sophia Lancaster," she replied, dabbing at her eyes. "I teach at the school." "Miss Lancaster," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I can understand why you might not want to go inside today." "I thought I could," she said softly. "I thought I was ready to face everyone, to hear the sermon about God's plan and purpose. But when I got here, I just—" She gestured helplessly. "I couldn't make my feet carry me through that door." The church door opened briefly, letting out a swell of music before closing again. A few curious glances came their way, but no one approached. "Would you like me to walk you home?" Frank offered. "Or maybe somewhere else? Sometimes being alone is the worst thing when you're grieving." Sophia looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, his face was too weathered by sun and wind for that, but there was a kindness in his blue eyes that seemed genuine. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "I just know I can't sit here crying all morning, and I can't go in there and pretend everything is fine when it isn't." Frank stood and offered her his hand. "Then let's walk, just down the street and back, no expectations." After a moment's hesitation, she took his hand and allowed him to help her up. His palm was rough with calluses but warm against her skin. She quickly released it once she was standing, smoothing down her dark blue dress, the closest thing to morning clothes she owned. They walked in silence at first, past the general store and the assayer's office, both closed for Sunday. St. Elmo had grown rapidly since silver was discovered in the area, but it was still small enough that most people knew each other, at least by sight. "I haven't seen you in town before," Sophia said finally. "I don't come in much," Frank replied. "Mainly for supplies or to ship cattle, sometimes to have a drink at the saloon." "You don't attend church?" He gave her a small, wry smile. "Not often. I reckon God and I have an understanding. I respect His creation, and He doesn't expect me to sit on a hard bench every Sunday morning." That drew a surprised laugh from her, small but real. "That's a unique arrangement. It works for us," he said with a shrug. "What about you? Are you usually a churchgoer?" "I was raised to be," she said. "And in a town this size, the teacher is expected to set an example. Expectations can be a heavy burden." She glanced at him, wondering if he was mocking her, but his expression remained sincere. "Yes," she agreed quietly, "they can be." They continued walking, turning onto a side street that led toward the mountains. The town was nestled in a valley, surrounded by peaks still capped with snow even in May. The contrast between the white mountaintops and the new green of spring in the valley was striking. "It's beautiful here," Frank said, following her gaze. "Different from the plains where I grew up." "Where was that?" "Kansas. My father had a small farm there. When he died, I sold it and headed west. Tried my hand at mining first, but I wasn't suited for it, being underground." He shook his head. "Give me open sky any day." "So you became a cattleman instead, eventually." "Worked as a ranch hand for years, saved every penny, bought my own place 4 years ago. It's not much, but it's mine." Sophia found herself genuinely interested. "And do you run it alone?" "I have a few hands, good men, and a housekeeper who comes in twice a week to make sure I haven't let the place fall to ruin." He smiled slightly. "Mrs. Rodriguez. She's about 60 and treats me like I'm 12, but she makes the best biscuits in 3 counties." Sophia smiled at that, picturing this tall, capable man being bossed around by a motherly housekeeper. "What about you?" Frank asked. "Have you always been a teacher?" "Since I was 18, she replied. "I came to St. Elmo 2 years ago. Before that, I taught in Denver." "What brought you here?" She hesitated. "A need for change. The city was overwhelming after a while." Frank sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't press. They had reached the edge of town now, where the buildings gave way to scattered homesteads and eventually the wilderness beyond. "We should turn back," Sophia said reluctantly. The walk had calmed her, and she wasn't eager to return to the church, where services would soon be ending. "Of course," Frank agreed, falling into step beside her as they retraced their path. They walked more comfortably now, the initial awkwardness between them fading. Sophia found herself noticing small details about her companion, the way he adjusted his stride to match hers, how he placed himself between her and the street when wagons passed by, the respectful nod he gave to others they encountered. As they approached the church, they could see people beginning to file out, the service having concluded. Sophia tensed, not ready to face the pitying looks and well-meaning but painful condolences. Frank seemed to understand without her saying a word. "Would you like to avoid the crowd? We could cut through the alley there." Relief washed over her. "Yes, please." He guided her down a narrow passage between buildings, emerging on a quieter street parallel to the main thoroughfare. "Where do you live?" he asked. "I'll see you home." "It's not necessary. I'd like to," he said simply. "If you don't mind." She found that she didn't. "It's just a few blocks this way. I have rooms above the milliner's shop." They walked in comfortable silence until they reached her building. Sophia paused at the external staircase that led to her apartment. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor, for the walk and for." She searched for the right words. for not saying that everything happens for a reason or that time heals all wounds. I've never found those sayings particularly helpful myself, he admitted. Grief is grief. It doesn't need reasons or timelines. She appreciated his understanding more than she could express. Will you be in town long, just today? I have business at the bank tomorrow morning, then I'll head back to my ranch. Sophia nodded, feeling a strange disappointment. Well, thank you again. Frank replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. It was my pleasure, Miss Lancaster, I hope. He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. I hope the days ahead are kinder to you. And to you, Mr. Taylor. He waited until she had climbed the stairs and entered her apartment before turning to leave. Sophia watched his retreating figure through her window, struck by the odd feeling that something significant had just occurred, though she couldn't have said exactly what. The next morning, Sophia rose early to prepare for school. Teaching was her refuge now, the one place where her grief receded to the background as she focused on her students. The one-room schoolhouse on the edge of town served children from ages 6 to 16, and managing their varying needs and abilities required her full attention. As she walked to school, she was surprised to see a familiar figure emerging from the bank. Frank Taylor nodded a greeting as she approached. Good morning, Miss Lancaster. Mr. Taylor, I thought you'd be heading back to your ranch by now. Shortly, he confirmed. My business took longer than expected. Are you well today? The simple question, asked without the usual overlay of pity she'd grown accustomed to, was refreshing. Better than yesterday. Thank you for asking. He smiled, and she noticed how it transformed his serious face, reaching his eyes and softening the weathered lines around them. I'm glad to hear it. And your business, was it successful? Yes, thankfully. The bank approved a loan for some new breeding stock. I'm expanding my herd this year. That sounds promising. It is. He hesitated, then added, I wonder if whatever he was about to say was interrupted by the arrival of several of Sophia's students calling out greetings as they approached. Miss Lancaster, Miss Lancaster, I finished that book you lent me. Miss Lancaster, can I show you the rock collection I started? She smiled at the children, then turned apologetically to Frank. I should go. The school bell rings in 15 minutes, of course, he said, stepping back. It was good seeing you again, Miss Lancaster. And you, Mr. Taylor. Safe travels back to your ranch. He tipped his hat and watched as she was swept along by her enthusiastic students. Something about her stayed with him as he mounted his horse and rode out of town, perhaps the quiet strength he sensed beneath her grief, or the genuine warmth with which she greeted her students. Whatever it was, Frank Taylor found himself thinking about Sophia Lancaster long after St. Elmo had disappeared behind him. The weeks that followed settled into a familiar routine for Sophia. She taught during the day, took her meals at the boarding house where several other single women in town lived, and spent her evenings reading or preparing lessons. Sundays remained difficult, but she forced herself to attend church, slipping in just as services began and leaving promptly afterward to avoid conversation. The pain of losing Daniel didn't diminish, but it changed, becoming less raw and more of a constant, dull ache. She wondered sometimes if this was what people meant when they spoke of time healing wounds, not that the wound disappeared, but that you grew accustomed to its presence. June brought warmer weather and the end of the school term. With summer stretching before her, Sophia feared the empty days would leave too much space for grief to fill. She volunteered to organize the town's Independence Day celebration, hoping the work would keep her occupied. It was during a planning meeting at the mayor's house that she heard Frank Taylor's name again. We'll need to reach out to the surrounding ranches for donations, Mayor Hollister was saying. The tailor spread has been generous in previous years. I can take that message, offered Jim Bennett, the postmaster. I'll be delivering mail out that way next week. Sophia found herself speaking before she'd fully formed the thought. I could go. I have time now that school is finished for the summer. The others looked at her in surprise. Sophia rarely volunteered for tasks that took her out of town. It's a fair distance, Mayor Hollister said doubtfully. Nearly a day's ride each way. I'm a capable rider, Sophia replied, lifting her chin slightly. And I'd welcome the chance to see more of the countryside. After some discussion, it was agreed that Sophia would make the journey, accompanied by the mayor's son, William, who knew the route well. They would leave in 2 days' time. Sophia couldn't explain, even to herself, why she'd volunteered. Perhaps it was simply the desire to break out of the routine her life had become, to feel something other than grief or numbness. Or perhaps it was the memory of the kindness Frank Taylor had shown her on what should have been her wedding day. Whatever the reason, she found herself looking forward to the trip with an eagerness that had been absent from her life for months. The morning of their departure dawned clear and mild. Sophia dressed practically in a split riding skirt and sturdy boots, her hair braided and pinned securely beneath a wide-brimmed hat. William Hollister, a good-natured young man of 20, was waiting with the horses when she arrived at the arranged meeting point. "Miss Lancaster," he greeted her cheerfully. "Ready for an adventure?" "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, checking the saddlebags that contained food for the journey and a change of clothes. They set out as the sun was rising, following the road west out of town, before turning onto a less traveled trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The scenery was breathtaking, wildflowers carpeted meadows between the trees, and the distant mountains provided a majestic backdrop. "It's beautiful country," Sophia remarked as they stopped to rest the horses near a stream. "It is," William agreed. "Have you not traveled much outside of St. Elmo since you arrived?" "No," she admitted. "There hasn't been much occasion." He nodded understandingly. "Well, Taylor's Ranch is in a particularly nice spot. Valley setting, protected by hills on 3 sides with a creek running through it. You know it well. I've been out there a few times with my father on business. Taylor's been expanding steadily since he bought the place. Started with just a few hundred acres and maybe 50 head of cattle. Now he's got one of the more prosperous operations in the county." Sophia was surprised. Frank had seemed modest about his achievements when they'd spoken. He must be a good businessman. "Smart and hardworking," William confirmed. "And fair too, from what I've heard. His hands stick with him, which says something in this part of the country where men tend to drift." They continued their journey, the trail gradually descending into a broad valley. By mid-afternoon, they could see the ranch in the distance, a collection of buildings nestled against the base of a hill, with fenced pastures stretching out before it. As they approached, Sophia felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. What if Frank didn't remember her? What if he found her presence presumptuous? A man working near the corral spotted them and called out to someone in the barn. Moments later, Frank himself emerged, shading his eyes against the sun as he watched their approach. Recognition dawned on his face as they drew closer, followed by what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Miss Lancaster," he said as they reined in their horses, "this is an unexpected surprise." "Mr. Taylor," she greeted him, suddenly self-conscious. "I hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," he assured her, helping her dismount with strong, steady hands. "You're both welcome. What brings you out this way?" William explained their mission regarding the Independence Day celebration while Frank listened attentively, his eyes occasionally drifting to Sophia. "You've had a long ride," Frank said when William finished. "Come inside and rest a while. Mrs. Rodriguez happened to be here today, so there's fresh coffee and probably something to eat." He led them to the main house, a solidly built structure of logs and stone that was larger than Sophia had expected. The interior was simple but comfortable, with polished wooden floors, sturdy furniture, and large windows that captured the valley views. Mrs. Rodriguez, a round-faced woman with graying hair and quick, efficient movements, welcomed them warmly and immediately set about preparing a meal. "Sit, sit," she insisted, ushering them to the kitchen table. "You must be tired and hungry." Over coffee and the promised biscuits, served with honey from Frank's own hives, they discussed the upcoming celebration. Frank readily agreed to donate beef for the town barbecue and offered the use of his wagons to transport people who lived too far to make the journey easily. "Will you be attending yourself?" Sophia asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "I hadn't planned to," he admitted, "but I might reconsider now." The way he looked at her as he said it made her cheeks warm, and she quickly changed the subject. "Your ranch is lovely. William told me you've expanded it considerably since you purchased it." "It's been a labor of love," Frank said, his passion for the place evident in his voice. "Would you like to see more of it? There's still daylight left." Sophia eagerly accepted, and Frank gave them a tour of the immediate grounds: the barn with its hayloft and tack room, the bunkhouse where his hands stayed, the smokehouse and root cellar, and the small orchard he'd planted when he first arrived. "The trees are just beginning to produce well," he said as they walked between rows of apple and pear trees. "Another year or two and we'll have more fruit than we know what to do with." "It's impressive what you've built here," Sophia said, genuinely admiring the thought and care that had gone into the place. "Thank you," Frank replied, looking pleased. "It's not finished yet. I doubt it ever will be. There's always something more to do, something to improve." "That's the mark of a good home, I think," she observed, "that it grows and changes with the people who live in it." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Yes, exactly, though sometimes I think it needs more than just my vision shaping it." Before Sophia could respond to that intriguing comment, William called out to them from the direction of the house. As they rejoined him, he explained that Mrs. Rodriguez had prepared the guest rooms and insisted they stay the night rather than begin the return journey so late in the day. "She's right," Frank said. "The trail can be tricky in the dark, even for those who know it well. You're welcome to stay." Sophia hesitated, conscious of propriety, but the thought of riding for hours as darkness fell was unappealing. "If you're certain it's no imposition." "None at all," Frank assured her. "It will be nice to have company for dinner. It's usually just me and my thoughts." That settled, they returned to the house. Mrs. Rodriguez had indeed prepared 2 guest rooms, one for William and one for Sophia. The room assigned to Sophia was simply but comfortably furnished, with a patchwork quilt on the bed and curtains that matched the wildflowers she'd admired on the journey. "This was my mother's room when she visited," Frank explained as he showed her in. "She only came once before she passed, but I've kept it ready." The personal connection touched Sophia. "It's lovely, thank you. Dinner will be at 6, he said, withdrawing to give her privacy. "Please make yourself at home until then." Sophia used the basin of water provided to wash away the dust of travel, then changed into the clean dress she'd brought. It was nothing fancy, a simple blue cotton with white trim, but it was more presentable than her riding clothes. When she joined the men in the dining room, she found the table set with care. Frank had changed as well, wearing a clean shirt with his usual denims. His hair was damp, suggesting he'd taken the time to wash up properly. The meal was simple but delicious: roast chicken, fresh vegetables from Frank's garden, and warm bread. The conversation flowed easily, touching on ranch matters, news from town, and memories of previous Independence Day celebrations. After dinner, they moved to the porch to enjoy the cool evening air and watch the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. William soon excused himself, tired from the day's journey, leaving Sophia and Frank alone. "Thank you for your hospitality," Sophia said after a comfortable silence. "It's been a pleasant surprise." "I'm the one who's been pleasantly surprised," Frank replied. "When I saw you riding up, I thought I must be imagining things." "Why is that?" He looked slightly embarrassed. "Because I've thought about you often since we met. I wondered how you were doing, if the days were getting any easier." His honesty was disarming. "They are in some ways," she admitted, "and in others not at all. Grief is like that," he said with understanding. "It ebbs and flows. You speak as though from experience." He nodded, his expression growing somber. "My wife died 6 years ago, childbirth. We'd been married just under a year." The revelation stunned Sophia. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry." "It was a long time ago now," he said quietly. "But I remember how it felt in those early days, like drowning on dry land." "Yes," she whispered, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "That's exactly how it feels." He reached across the space between their chairs and gently covered her hand with his. "It does get better. Not quickly and not in a straight line, but it does." They sat in silence for a while, his hand warm over hers, watching as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Sophia felt a connection to Frank that went beyond their shared experience of loss, a sense that he saw her clearly, both her pain and the person she was beneath it. "Tell me about your wife," she said finally, "if you don't mind speaking of her." Frank seemed surprised by the request but not displeased. "Her name was Emily. She was from Denver. Her father was a banker. We met when I was delivering cattle there. She was nothing like the women I'd known growing up, educated, refined, but with a sense of adventure that drew her to the idea of ranch life." He smiled at the memory. "Her parents thought she was mad to marry a cattleman and move to the middle of nowhere. She must have loved you very much." "I believe she did," he said softly, "and I her. We didn't have much time together, but what we had was good. And after, did you never think of marrying again?" Frank was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "At first, I couldn't imagine it. Then, as time passed, I suppose I got used to being alone. The ranch kept me busy. But lately—" He looked at her, his expression open and honest. "Lately, I've been thinking that a man wasn't meant to live his whole life without companionship." The intensity of his gaze made Sophia's heart beat faster. She gently withdrew her hand from his, not ready for whatever was building between them. "It's getting late. I should probably turn in." Frank accepted her retreat with grace. "Of course. You've had a long day." He stood when she did, ever the gentleman. "Sleep well, Miss Lancaster." "Good night, Mr. Taylor," she replied, pausing at the door. "And thank you for sharing your story with me. It helps to know that someone else understands." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the first stars of the evening. "Any time you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Sophia carried those words with her as she prepared for bed, finding comfort in the knowledge that she wasn't alone in her journey through grief. As she drifted towards sleep, she realized that, for the first time in months, she'd spent hours without Daniel's death being at the forefront of her thoughts. The realization brought both relief and guilt, the familiar struggle of a heart beginning to heal while fearing that healing meant forgetting. Morning came with the sounds of the ranch, already stirring voices of men heading to their tasks, the lowing of cattle, the clatter of equipment being readied for the day's work. Sophia dressed quickly and found her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Rodriguez was preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Miss Lancaster," the housekeeper greeted her warmly. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Sophia replied, and it was true. The ranch's peaceful setting and her conversation with Frank had combined to give her the most restful night she'd experienced in months. "Mr. Taylor is already out checking the herd," Mrs. Rodriguez informed her as she placed a cup of coffee before Sophia. "He said to tell you he'll be back before you and young Mr. Hollister depart." William joined them shortly, and they enjoyed a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and more of Mrs. Rodriguez's excellent biscuits. They were just finishing when Frank returned, bringing with him the fresh scent of morning air and pine. "I hope you both slept well," he said, accepting the plate Mrs. Rodriguez handed him. "Like logs," William replied cheerfully. "Those beds could tempt a man to oversleep." "Miss Lancaster." Frank's gaze was warm as it met hers. "Very comfortably, thank you," she said, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach at his attention. After breakfast, they prepared to leave. Frank personally saddled their horses and packed their saddlebags with food for the journey home: sandwiches, apples, and cookies that Mrs. Rodriguez insisted they take. As they were mounting up, Frank approached Sophia's horse. "I meant to give you this," he said, handing her a small book. "Poetry. Emily used to read it when she was feeling low. I thought you might enjoy it too." Sophia took the volume, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. I'll take good care of it. Keep it as long as you like," he said. Then more quietly, so William couldn't hear, "I hope to see you at the Independence Day celebration. Perhaps we could continue our conversation." "I'd like that," she replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. With final thanks and farewells, they set off, Frank watching until they disappeared around a bend in the trail. Sophia found herself looking back more than once, the little book of poetry secure in her saddlebag and Frank's invitation warming her heart. The journey back to St. Elmo seemed quicker than the outward trip, perhaps because Sophia's mind was full of new thoughts and possibilities. She and William arrived in town by late afternoon, reporting their successful mission to Mayor Hollister, before Sophia returned to her apartment above the milliner's shop. That evening, she curled up with the book Frank had given her. It was a collection by various poets, the pages well thumbed and occasionally marked with small notes in a delicate hand that must have been Emily's. Sophia read until late, finding solace in the words and a strange connection to the woman who had read them before her. The following weeks were busy with preparations for the Independence Day celebration. Sophia threw herself into the work, coordinating food donations, organizing games for children, and helping to decorate the town square. The activity was therapeutic, giving her purpose and keeping her connected to the community in a way she hadn't been since Daniel's death. In quiet moments, she found herself thinking of Frank, his kindness, his understanding, and the quiet strength he radiated. She reread the poetry book often, sometimes tracing the penciled notes in the margins and wondering about the woman who had made them. As July 4th approached, anticipation built in St. Elmo. The celebration was the highlight of the summer for many in the isolated mountain community, bringing together people from town and the surrounding homesteads for a day of food, music, games, and companionship. The morning of the celebration dawned clear and warm. Sophia was up early, helping to set up tables in the town square and hanging red, white, and blue bunting from every available surface. By noon, the festivities were in full swing, children racing in sack races, women comparing pies and preserves, men competing in horseshoe pitching and arm wrestling contests. Frank's promised beef was the centerpiece of the barbecue, and his wagons had indeed brought in families from outlying areas. But Sophia had yet to see the man himself, and as the afternoon wore on, she found herself scanning the crowd with increasing frequency, hoping to catch a glimpse of his tall figure, looking for someone. asked Elizabeth Peabody, one of the other teachers in town, as they served lemonade to thirsty celebrants. "No," Sophia replied too quickly, then sighed at Elizabeth's knowing look. "Perhaps. Frank Taylor said he might attend." "The cattleman?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "He rarely comes to town events." "He was kind enough to donate the beef for the barbecue," Sophia said defensively. "I simply wanted to thank him in person." Elizabeth looked like she might say more, but at that moment, a cheer went up from the crowd near the edge of the square. Sophia turned to see several horsemen arriving, and among them, Frank Taylor. He dismounted gracefully, exchanging greetings with those nearby. He was dressed more formally than Sophia had seen him before: clean denims, a crisp white shirt, and a vest that emphasized his broad shoulders. His hat was new as well, or at least not the work-worn one she'd seen previously. She tried to continue serving lemonade naturally, but her eyes kept drifting to where Frank stood. Eventually, he turned and their gazes met across the crowded square. A smile spread across his face, and he began making his way toward her, stopping occasionally to shake hands or exchange words with townspeople. "Miss Lancaster," he said when he finally reached her, removing his hat. "It's good to see you again." "Mr. Taylor," she replied, aware of Elizabeth watching with undisguised interest. "I'm glad you decided to come after all." "I had a compelling reason," he said simply, his eyes warm. "Your celebration looks to be a great success." "Thanks in part to your generosity," she acknowledged. The beef was appreciated by all. They stood for a moment, the conversation hovering on the edge of something more personal, before Elizabeth cleared her throat pointedly. "Oh," Sophia started. "Mr. Taylor, this is Miss Peabody, who teaches the older students at our school." "Elizabeth, this is Mr. Frank Taylor." They exchanged pleasantries, and then Elizabeth, with a meaningful glance at Sophia, excused herself to help with the pie judging. "Would you like to walk for a bit?" Frank asked once they were alone. "It's rather crowded here." Sophia hesitated, glancing at the lemonade stand. "I should help with—" "Go on," Elizabeth called, having not gone far. "I'll manage here." With a grateful smile, Sophia untied her apron and set it aside. Frank offered his arm, and she took it, acutely aware of the curious glances that followed them as they moved away from the center of the celebration. They walked toward the church, which stood a little apart from the main square, its steps where they had first spoken now empty and peaceful. "I've been reading the poetry," Sophia said as they strolled. "Thank you again for lending it to me." "You're welcome." "Did you find it helpful?" "Very much so," she admitted. "There's comfort in knowing others have felt the same darkness and survived it." Frank nodded, understanding. "Emily used to say that good poetry puts into words what the heart knows but the mind can't express." "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," he agreed, a fond sadness in his voice. Then, after a pause, "Tell me about Daniel, if you'd like. What kind of man was he?" The question took Sophia by surprise. Few people invited her to speak of Daniel, as if mentioning him might shatter her composure or remind her of what she'd lost, as if she could ever forget. He was. She searched for the right words. Kind, steady. He loved music, he played the fiddle beautifully, though he'd never had a lesson. He had plans to build us a house on the edge of town, with a garden for me and a workshop for him to craft furniture in his spare time. The memories came more easily than she'd expected, tinged with sadness but no longer unbearable. He laughed often and made others laugh too. Frank listened attentively, asking occasional questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. They sat on the church steps, the sounds of the celebration a distant backdrop to their conversation. "Thank you," Sophia said finally, "for asking about him. Most people avoid the subject." "People mean well," Frank replied. But sometimes what a grieving heart needs most is to speak the name of the loved one aloud, to know they're remembered. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town. "Would you join me for the fireworks this evening?" Frank asked eventually. "They're setting them off at the lake just outside town." Sophia considered the invitation. To be seen watching the fireworks together would certainly start tongues wagging in a town like St. Elmo, but she found she didn't care as much as she might have once. "I'd like that," she said simply. They returned to the celebration, where Sophia introduced Frank to more of the townspeople she knew well. He was polite but somewhat reserved, clearly more comfortable one-on-one than in large gatherings. Still, he made an effort, even joining in a horseshoe pitching contest, which he won handily. As evening approached, they shared a meal at one of the long tables set up for the barbecue, joined by several of Sophia's colleagues from the school. Frank was quiet among the teachers' animated discussions of educational theories and summer reading lists, but Sophia noticed how attentively he listened, occasionally asking a thoughtful question that revealed more intelligence and education than his rough cattleman's exterior might suggest. When darkness began to fall, people started making their way toward the small lake a quarter-mile from town, where the fireworks display would take place. Frank and Sophia walked together, carrying a blanket he'd brought from his saddlebags. They found a spot on a gentle rise with a good view of the lake. Frank spread the blanket on the grass, and they sat side by side, not touching but close enough that Sophia was acutely aware of his presence. "Thank you for today," she said as they waited for the show to begin. "I've enjoyed your company." "As I've enjoyed yours," he replied, his voice low and sincere. "More than I expected to enjoy anything when I rode into town this morning." Before she could respond, the first firework exploded above the lake, a burst of red and gold that reflected in the still water below. The crowd gasped and applauded, and more followed brilliant displays of color and light against the dark sky. In the intermittent illumination, Sophia glanced at Frank's profile, struck by the openness of his expression as he watched the spectacle. There was something almost childlike in his wonder, a quality she found endearing in a man otherwise so self-contained. When his hand found hers on the blanket between them, she didn't pull away. His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and secure, and they watched the remainder of the display in a silence that felt more intimate than any conversation. As the final bursts faded and the crowd began to disperse, Frank turned to her, his face serious in the moonlight. "I'll be heading back to my ranch in the morning, but I'd like to see you again, Sophia, if you're willing." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent a small thrill through her. "I'd like that too, Frank. Perhaps you could visit the ranch again sometime, or I could come into town when my work allows," she smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Either would be nice." He escorted her back to her apartment, their hands occasionally brushing as they walked, but neither quite bold enough to take hold again outside the privacy of their hillside vantage point. At her door, Frank removed his hat and held it against his chest, suddenly seeming almost shy. "Good night, Sophia. Thank you for making today special." "Good night, Frank," she replied, gathering her courage to add, "I'll look forward to your next visit to town." He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face and made him almost handsome. "It won't be long," he promised, then turned to go, glancing back once before disappearing into the night. Sophia entered her apartment, her mind and heart full of contradictory emotions: happiness at the connection she'd found with Frank, guilt at feeling such happiness when Daniel had been gone only a few months, fear of what people might say, and excitement about possibilities she'd thought forever closed to her. She slept fitfully that night, dreams mingling past and present in confusing sequences. But when she woke, one thing was clear for the first time since the mine collapse. She was looking forward to the future rather than dwelling in the past. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Frank would ride into St. Elmo every weekend or two, usually arriving on Saturday morning and departing Sunday afternoon. They would walk together, sometimes talk for hours, occasionally join other townspeople for meals or social events. People noticed, of course. In a town the size of St. Elmo, two unmarried adults spending time together was bound to generate gossip. Some thought it scandalous that Sophia would consider another man so soon after Daniel's death. Others, particularly those who had experienced loss themselves, seemed to understand her need for companionship and were supportive. Sophia tried not to let the whispers bother her, focusing instead on the growing connection between her and Frank. They spoke of books they'd read, childhood memories, dreams for the future. He told her about his plans for the ranch, and she shared her ideas for improving the school curriculum. They also continued to talk about their lost loved ones, finding healing in the shared remembrance. There was no jealousy in these conversations. Both understood that the love they had felt for Daniel and Emily wasn't diminished by what was developing between them now. In August, Frank invited Sophia to visit his ranch again, this time for a proper social call rather than official business. Mrs. Rodriguez would be present as chaperone, he assured her, mindful of propriety. Sophia accepted, arranging to travel with the mail coach that made weekly runs to outlying ranches. The journey was less comfortable than horseback had been, the coach jostling over rough trails, but she arrived at the Taylor Ranch by mid-afternoon, eager to see Frank again. He was waiting for her, his face lighting up when he saw her descend from the coach. "You came," he said, as if he'd half expected her to change her mind. "Of course I did," she replied, smoothing her travel-wrinkled dress. "I've been looking forward to it all week." He showed her the improvements he'd made since her last visit, a new section added to the barn, an expanded vegetable garden, the beginnings of a proper flower bed near the house that he admitted was inspired by her comment about making the place feel more like a home. Mrs. Rodriguez had prepared an elaborate dinner, clearly pleased to have a guest to cook for. She treated Sophia with a warm familiarity that suggested Frank had spoken of her often. After the meal, Frank and Sophia sat on the porch swing as the sun set, talking quietly about everything and nothing. When he hesitantly put his arm around her shoulders, she leaned into him, feeling safe and content in a way she hadn't believed possible months ago. "I'm falling in love with you, Sophia," he said softly, the words hanging in the twilight air between them. "I didn't expect it and I don't want to rush you, but I needed you to know." She turned to look at him, her heart pounding. "Frank, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know it's soon and you're still healing. I just wanted to be honest about where I stand." Sophia took a deep breath. "I care for you too, Frank, more than I thought possible, but you're right, I'm still finding my way through grief. Can you be patient with me a little longer?" he smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "I can be patient as long as needed. Knowing you feel something too is enough for now." The weekend passed too quickly, filled with simple pleasures, horseback rides to see the farthest reaches of the ranch, quiet reading together in the afternoons, shared meals with Mrs. Rodriguez providing motherly supervision and occasional knowing smiles. When it was time for Sophia to return to town, Frank drove her himself in his wagon, taking the opportunity to hold her hand as they traveled. At the edge of St. Elmo, before they would be visible to curious eyes, he stopped the wagon. "May I write to you?" he asked. "Between visits." "I'd like that very much," she replied. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he kissed her, a gentle, brief touch of lips that nonetheless left her breathless. "Until next time," he said as he pulled back, his eyes full of promise. "Until then," she echoed, knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them. The letters began arriving regularly after that, once or twice a week, delivered by the mail coach or sometimes by one of Frank's ranch hands who had business in town. They were thoughtful missives, detailing his daily life, asking about hers, sometimes including a poem or a pressed wildflower from the valley. Sophia kept them tied with ribbon in her dresser drawer, reading them often and crafting careful replies. Through the written word, they shared thoughts and feelings that were sometimes harder to express face to face. As summer gave way to fall, their relationship deepened. Frank's visits to town continued, and Sophia made the journey to the ranch twice more. They were careful to maintain propriety, always with chaperones present. Never alone behind closed doors, but there was no hiding the attachment growing between them. In October, as the aspen trees turned golden and the first hints of winter crept into the mountain air, Frank arrived in St. Elmo on an ordinary Saturday morning. But instead of his usual casual attire, he wore his best suit and a new hat, and his horse was groomed to a shine. He found Sophia at the schoolhouse where she was preparing Monday's lessons. His serious expression immediately concerned her. "Frank, is something wrong?" "No," he said, removing his hat. "Nothing's wrong, but I need to speak with you about something important. Would you walk with me?" Intrigued, she set aside her work and accompanied him. They strolled through town and beyond, to a small meadow where late wildflowers still bloomed despite the chill in the air. "You know what day it is?" Frank asked as they stood among the flowers. "Saturday, October 14th, Sophia replied, puzzled. 6 years ago today I lost Emily," he said quietly. "I've marked this day in solitude every year since. But this year I wanted to be with you." Understanding dawned, and Sophia took his hand. "Oh, Frank, are you sure?" "I know how difficult these anniversary days can be." "I'm sure," he said firmly, "because being with you has helped me understand something. Loving again doesn't dishonor what I had with Emily, it honors it. She taught me how to love, how to open my heart, and she would want me to be happy." Tears pricked at Sophia's eyes, moved by his words. "I believe Daniel would want the same for me," she whispered. Frank took both her hands in his. "Sophia Lancaster, these past months with you have been the happiest I've known in years. You've brought light back into my life when I thought the darkness might be permanent." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands, and Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "I love you," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you, a life where we honor the past but live fully in the present, where we face whatever comes together. Will you marry me?" Sophia looked down at this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, who had understood her grief because he had walked the same path, who had been patient and kind and steadfast. The answer rose from her heart without hesitation. "Yes," she said, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you, Frank." He rose and embraced her, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Inside was a ring not ostentatious but beautifully crafted, a small pearl surrounded by delicate silver work. "It was my grandmother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "If you'd prefer something else, it's perfect," she interrupted, admiring how it caught the autumn sunlight. "Absolutely perfect." They walked back to town hand in hand, ready to share their news with the world. There would be those who thought it too soon, Sophia knew, but she no longer cared. Life was too precious, too unpredictable to waste in fear of others' judgments. They were married on Christmas Eve, 1882, in the very church where they had first met. The building was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, candles glowing in every window. Despite the winter weather, the church was full Frank's ranch hands and business associates, Sophia's fellow teachers and students, townspeople who had watched their courtship with varying degrees of approval, but who came now to wish them well. Sophia wore a dress of deep blue velvet rather than traditional white, acknowledging that this was a second chance at love for both of them rather than a first beginning. Frank looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in his formal suit, his eyes never leaving her as she walked down the aisle. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to cherish each other, to face life's joys and sorrows together, to build a home filled with love and understanding. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Frank's kiss was tender and reverent, a sealed promise before all who had gathered. The celebration afterward was joyous music and dancing in the town hall, food and drink aplenty. Congratulations from even those who had once whispered about the propriety of their courtship. As midnight approached, they slipped away, boarding the sleigh Frank had prepared to take them to the ranch, their home now, not just his. The journey through the snowy night was magical, wrapped in furs against the cold, the stars brilliant above them and the runners of the sleigh hissing over the packed snow. Frank had arranged for Mrs. Rodriguez to leave earlier in the day, ensuring they would have privacy for their first night as husband and wife. The house was warm and welcoming when they arrived, a fire blazing in the hearth and candles lit throughout. Frank carried Sophia across the threshold in the traditional manner, setting her gently on her feet in what was now their shared home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Taylor," he said softly. She reached up to touch his face, still sometimes amazed that this good man was now her husband. "Thank you for waiting for me on those church steps," she whispered, "for asking the question that changed everything." "I think I've been waiting for you my whole life," he replied, drawing her close, "even when I didn't know it." Their first night together was a discovery of each other, tender and passionate by turns. There was some initial awkwardness, as was natural for two people learning each other's bodies for the first time, but also laughter and whispered words of love, creating memories that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The winter months that followed were a time of adjustment as they settled into married life. Sophia continued teaching in town, staying at their apartment there during the week and joining Frank at the ranch on weekends. It wasn't an ideal arrangement, but it worked until the school term ended. Spring brought changes. Sophia resigned from her teaching position, planning instead to establish a small school at the ranch for the children of Frank's hands and neighboring homesteaders. The house was expanded to include a proper classroom space, and by summer, a dozen children of various ages were receiving regular instruction. Frank's business continued to prosper. With Sophia by his side, he found himself more willing to socialize, establishing connections with other ranchers and businessmen that proved valuable. They hosted dinners at the ranch, attended community events in St. Elmo, and gradually built a wider circle of friends. Their first child, a son they named Thomas Daniel Taylor, was born in February 1884, a healthy, strong boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. Frank was a devoted father from the first moment, sometimes carrying the infant with him as he went about his ranch duties, pointing out cattle and horses to the uncomprehending but contented baby. Sophia balanced motherhood with her small school, sometimes teaching with Thomas sleeping in a cradle beside her desk. The arrangement worked well, allowing her to fulfill both her maternal instincts and her passion for education. As Thomas grew into toddlerhood, the ranch expanded further. Frank added more land, increased his herd, and hired additional hands. The prosperity allowed them to make improvements to the house: indoor plumbing, more comfortable furnishings, a piano for Sophia, who had always loved music. Their daughter, Emily Rose Taylor, joined the family in September 1886. She was a lively child from the start, curious and determined, with a smile that wrapped everyone around her tiny fingers, especially her besotted father. Life wasn't without its challenges. The winter of 1887 was particularly harsh, with blizzards that threatened the herd and isolated the ranch for weeks. There was a difficult period when cattle prices fell dramatically, forcing them to economize and work harder than ever to keep the ranch solvent. Sophia experienced a miscarriage between Thomas and Emily that left them both grieving what might have been. But through it all, their partnership remained strong. They faced each challenge together, drawing on each other's strengths, comforting each other in moments of weakness. The love that had begun so unexpectedly on those church steps deepened with each passing year, enriched by shared experiences and mutual respect. They never forgot their first loves. Daniel and Emily were spoken of openly in their home, their memories honored rather than avoided. Thomas and little Emily grew up knowing the stories of the people for whom they were partly named, understanding that love didn't diminish when shared or remembered. On a warm Sunday in May 1892, Frank and Sophia sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. Thomas, now 8, was showing his 5-year-old sister how to lasso a fence post, both of them laughing when the rope went astray. "Do you ever think about that day?" Frank asked, his hand finding Sophia's as they rocked gently on the porch swing. "When I found you crying on the church steps." "Often," she admitted. "It was the worst day of my life, or so I thought at the time. I couldn't have imagined then that it would lead to this." She gestured to encompass their home, their children, the life they'd built together. "I nearly rode past," he confessed. "I wasn't planning to stop in town at all that day, but something about you sitting there alone." He shook his head, still somewhat amazed at how differently things might have gone. "I'm glad you didn't ride past," Sophia said softly. "I'm glad you asked the question that made me cry harder but ultimately helped me begin to heal." Frank squeezed her hand. "Do you think they know?" "Daniel and Emily, that we found happiness again." It was a question they'd discussed before, both being people of faith but also of practical minds. Sophia's answer was the same as always. "I believe they do," she said. "And I believe they are at peace knowing we are too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as Thomas finally managed to loop the rope around the post, earning a cheer from his sister. Soon they would call the children in for dinner. Then there would be baths and bedtime stories, followed by quiet hours for just the two of them before sleep. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, a life built from the ashes of grief, founded on understanding and mutual respect, and sustained by a love that had healed them both. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Frank leaned over to kiss his wife's cheek. "I love you, Sophia Taylor, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." She turned to meet his lips with hers, a kiss as sweet as their first. "And I love you, Frank Taylor, always and completely." In the yard, their children's laughter rang out, a joyful sound that echoed across the valley as night fell on the home they had created together.